Mr. Stein.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to participate in the subcommittee hearing on the federal government involvement in solar and wind energy research. My name is Kenny Stein. I'm the policy director for the Institute for Energy Research. We're a free market organization that conducts research and analysis on the functions, operations, and government regulation of global energy markets. The purpose of the federal government funding for research in any industry should be limited and clearly defined. The justification for such funding is that research in emerging or novel technologies would not otherwise be provided by private interests, whether companies or individuals. This is a reasonable role for the government to play. However, this can't be a license to spend money. Federal support should not go to projects that private interests already have a clear incentive to develop. Far too often, it's the case that the federal government provides grant money to companies to subsidize activities that they would already be undertaking. The content of the discussion drafts for this hearing slips into precisely this error. Wind and solar generation are widespread and well understood. Utilities and independent generators across the country have announced large targets for investments in increasing wind and solar installations, some of which were mentioned by the previous witness. This action is being taken in response to regulatory and consumer demand. This investment record doesn't suggest a shortage of private sector funding or commitment to wind and solar generation. The companies making these investments already have market and regulatory incentives to, quote, increase efficiency, reliability, security, and capacity of wind and solar generation, which is just quoting the first mission bullet of the discussion draft. Both the wind and solar industries are mature industries with plenty of private sector interest and investment in innovation and deployment. We're not talking about nascent or speculative industry. The need for federal funding at all is pretty debatable, to put it mildly. If federal money is still required at this point, the question must be asked, is there ever going to be a point where enough is enough? Given the already high rate of wind and solar investment, it's hard to see how more federal invention could possibly be beneficial. In fact, a heavier federal hand could end up limiting growth and innovation. The federal government, slow and process constrained as it is, cannot adjust rapidly to technological developments. As new operating processes or products enter the market, it can be left funding old or obsolete initiatives. Indeed, federal interference of the sort envisioned by these discussion drafts can actually lead an industry to spend its time trying to meet federal benchmarks for grants rather than asking the question whether an alternative might make more sense, which could ironically actually limit innovation. The best example of an appropriate role for the federal research funding can be found in the earliest days of solar energy generation. Early solar panels with poor efficiency found little uptake for terrestrial resource uses. However, the burgeoning space program identified solar as a potential energy source for spacecraft. Government funding from NASA then helped develop solar technology to the point where it is usable in space applications. And then years later, solar companies built on that foundation to develop the generation technologies that are now being applied to terrestrial electricity generation. The lesson here is that the federal government didn't choose a solar technology and then try to commercialize it or reduce its costs. The basic technology was developed for a specific national purpose, with private innovation later finding applications for the private market. This is how the process should work. The federal government does not have the characteristics or competency to be a startup accelerator, but it can effectively provide a base level of data and information for private innovators to build on. Thus, a better path forward for federal research spending would be focusing on the original mission that I suggested above, funding emerging or novel technologies and applications not otherwise supported by private interests. One example of this kind of focus is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory research into the use of perovskite material, as mentioned earlier, in solar cells. This is the kind of basic research the federal government should be funding, leaving private entities to determine the most useful applications of these discoveries. There is a legitimate federal role in supporting such basic research that has the potential to improve the overall well-being of the American people or is required to meet a specific federal need. Note that this is not just a branding exercise with anything called early stage or basic becoming eligible for funding. Federal research spending should focus on truly novel technologies or applications. Further, this should not just be a license to spend more money. Clearly focusing federal priorities means discarding some spending areas sometimes to hone in on research at, for example, the national labs or universities, a case where less can actually be more effective. The premise underlying these discussion drafts, then, in my opinion, is unsound. Mature industries like the wind and solar generation sectors with extensive and dynamic economic activity are not in need of federal interference, however well-intentioned. While basic research is a reasonable federal role, responsibility for later phases of the business cycle, such as commercialization or deployment, is best left in the hands of the industry itself. Thank you.